Hello everyone, and I welcome you all to the second session of the course History of English Language and Literature. In today's session, we will discuss Old English literature in detail, but before we proceed, let me give you a rapid recap of the previous session. We already noted that the British Isles witnessed the Teutonic migration of three principal Germanic tribes in the first half of the 5th century AD, and the Germanic groups that attacked England mostly consisted of three tribes: the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Thereafter, we also find the Jutes gets completely displaced as they were fewer in population and the country was named Angleland, which later evolved to England. The invaders subjugated England after the fall of the Roman dominion and eventually assimilated into the local culture. The heavily inflected language system of these people gradually separated from its Germanic roots and mixed with that of Christianized Celts that later came to be known as Old English. After that, Scandinavian raiders like Danes and Norwegians, who were also known as Vikings by the English, contributed to this linguistic mix to some extent. However, they did not leave a very lasting impact since they were inclined to attack and flee rather than establish permanent settlements in England. And it's only after their conversion to Christianity in the 7th century that the Anglo-Saxons began to develop a written literature. Not only did the churches and monastic organizations convert England to Christianity, but they also had the most impact on the advancement of British culture, literacy, and education. Even if it happened slowly, the Christianization of England was unavoidable, and soon after, King Ethelbert converted himself to Christianity and appointed St. Augustine as the first Archbishop of Canterbury. As we covered in our previous session, Old English literature was primarily oral in nature, with just a few writings having survived to this day. So, if we analyze the subject matter of Anglo-Saxon literature, then we can see that the corpus of Anglo-Saxon or Old English literature may broadly be divided into three categories. The first is Anglo-Saxon pagan or pre-Christian poetry, usually referred to as heroic poetry, which primarily honors the valor and triumphs of warriors in conflict and conquest. Anglo-Saxon lyric and elegiac poetry, on the other hand, deals with themes of loss and fleeting nature of life, fate, exile, wanderings, etc., while expressing a conflict with the pagan heroic norms of valor, loyalty, and honor. Second is the Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry, which explores themes of spiritual struggles, redemption, biblical narratives, and Christian values like forgiveness, humility, and charity. Then comes the Anglo-Saxon or Old English prose, which primarily deals with religious texts and sermons, historical accounts like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, legal writings, and translations from Latin and other languages. Now let's start our discussion with the Old English literature, which continued from 450 to 1066 AD. We already know that the Old English language was mostly a Germanic foreign tongue, so there was hardly any resemblance to the modern English language, and that's why they had to be translated in order for us to understand or make any sense of it. Though many of the works have undergone changes, still several of them have disappeared altogether, and only some 30,000 lines of Old English poetry have survived. The bulk of these works are preserved in four great monastic codices of the 11th century, and these are the Vercelli book, the Exeter book, the manuscript Cotton Vitellius, and the Junius manuscript. Among them, the Vercelli book is perhaps the earliest, and it contains 29 pieces including the Dream of the Rood, Eileen, and Andreas. Next is the Exeter book, which contains some of the best-known secular verses such as The Wanderer and The Seafarer, with two signed poems of Beowulf. On the other hand, the manuscript Cotton Vitellius is famous for containing the copy of the epic poem Beowulf, and then comes the Junius manuscript, which is mostly known for containing four long Old English poems: Genesis, Exodus, Daniel, and Christ and Satan. The two most notable people connected to Old English poetry were Kidman and Beowulf. While Beowulf is renowned for his attribution to certain specific poems like the Fates of the Apostles and Eileen, Kidman is regarded as the first Old English Christian poet due to his hymn. So let's begin our discussion with some of the Old English literary classics that are still relevant and being discussed today. Our first topic is Beowulf, which is probably the first and most important work of English literature and also describes the heroic attributes of the Anglo-Saxon society. It's a Teutonic epic poem of unknown authorship and is considered the earliest existing manuscript. In fact, this is perhaps the only English text that survived the ravages of time and was found in a single manuscript. Though it wasn't totally intact because it was partly damaged in the fire, it's still about 3,200 lines and written in about 1000 AD. The poem was written in the West Saxon dialect and it was assumed to be the work of a monk or someone else with an academic qualification who wrote this poem, which was passed on by word of mouth for approximately 300 years. This work is partly historical and partly mythical as it revolves around a 6th century warrior from Geatland and his heroic exploits. The poem is divided into two main parts, and the first part deals with Beowulf visiting the Great Hall of Herod, built by the Danish king Hrothgar, and slaying a monster named Grendel. Beowulf killed the monster by wrenching out its arm, but soon after that Grendel's mother retaliated by taking one of the Danish nobles to her underwater den. Naturally, Beowulf pursues her there and kills her after fighting a formidable battle. The second part begins after Beowulf became the king and ruled over the Geats for almost 50 years when suddenly his kingdom was invaded by a fiery dragon. Despite his age, he manages to kill the dragon with the aid of a young nobleman called Wiglaf, but unfortunately he becomes mortally wounded in the fight and pronounces Wiglaf as his successor before his death. Although Beowulf is generally accepted as a pagan poem, the Christian elements can't be overlooked because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the extant version of this epic poem was clearly written by a Christian monk who must have reworked the original material. However, these Christian elements have no jarring effect on the poem and the biblical interpolations do not detract from the poem's pagan vitality. There are also other heroic poems that are based on war and heroism, but unfortunately, no other heroic poems of the Old English era have the success of Beowulf, as they lack the chivalrous ideal of great epics, and also because their heroic note is mainly manifested in a savage spirit of vengeance and cruelty. Since the Anglo-Saxons were mainly a warring, hunting, and nomadic people, their poems inevitably had a greater affinity to heroic incidents or narratives. Despite the predominance of heroic narratives, we still found the presence of lyric and elegiac elements in their verses, where the poets described their thoughts, moods, and experiences in a highly subjective manner. Most of the well-known Anglo-Saxon lyrics and elegies were written in the Exeter book, and despite not being interconnected with each other, they still display similar qualities of being meditative in character and can be called monologues. The first is The Wanderer, which is an Old English elegy of 115 lines that is preserved in the Exeter book and is the work of an unknown Anglo-Saxon poet. The subject matter of the elegy is the lamentation of a young man who used to serve a generous lord, but after his master's death, he became a lonely wanderer and began his journey across the seas. It is one of the greatest examples of personal elegy as it describes the poet's personal emotion and his genuine lamentation for his lord, which is also a chief trait of lyrical poetry. The Exeter book also contains the Seafarer, which is structurally divided into two parts that have nothing to do with each other. It has the same melancholy, the same intermix of regret and self-pity that we found in The Wanderer, as the first part of the poem presents a monologue of an old sailor who recalls the loneliness and hardships of a life at sea, but at the same time he continues to be aware of the fascination of a perennially voyaging life. On the other side, the second half of the poem is a homiletic discourse which is perhaps intended to draw a general moral from the seafarer's description as it considers the transience of worldly bliss and praises humble, honest living. Dior's Lament or the Complaint of Diors is another important short poem of 42 lines that is found in the Exeter book, and the subject matter is quite interesting as it describes the complaints of a minstrel who, after years of service to his lord, was replaced by a rival and has been deprived of his lands and fortunes. The narrator used familiar situations of misery and suffering from history and mythology to comfort himself with the thought that God will soon improve his fortunes. We also get fascinating glimpses of figures who were famous in old Germanic history and legends, which leads us to believe that maybe there was a set of people who loved to listen to folklore of the great mighty feats of the warriors. The author makes the subject matter with a very personal elegiac theme, which was extremely uncommon at that time, making it a very notable poem. Even while some scholars think the lament is just a typical way to introduce great legends, the poem's tone nonetheless remains intensely personal. Next, there is the wife's lament, the husband's message, and Wolf and Edwesa, which may be taken as embryonic examples of English love poetry. The former records the lament of a wife whose husband has committed a crime and has been banished. Soon after, his kinsmen plotted against her and forced her to live in a cave in the forest. The chronological events are not properly clear, and the circumstances of her husband's exile are not fully explained either, but despite this obscurity, the woman's passionate lament poignantly expresses her segregation and longing for her husband. The wife's lament is unpretentious and sincere in feeling and may be taken as one of the earliest instances of English love poetry, while on the other side, the husband's message is also found in the Exeter book, and the subject matter of this elegy deals with a message apparently carved on a wooden board. The message is addressed to a wife by her husband, who has been forced to flee the land because of a feud, but he still sends her assurances of his love and requests her to travel south so that she can join him in spring. Wolf and Edwesa is another short and enigmatic fragment of 19 lines which expresses the sorrow and intense romantic passion of a woman who is separated from her lover by another man. It is written in first-person narrative, and most probably Wolf is the woman's outlawed lover and Edwesa is her hated husband. Apparently, she has or will soon give birth to Wolf's child, and that's why she fears that she and her unborn child will be persecuted. The nature and sequence of events related by the poem remain unclear, but the emotional intensity of the poem displayed by the fragment is quite uncharacteristic of surviving Old English poetry. These three poems, the wife's lament, the husband's message, and Wolf and Edweka, together form the core of Anglo-Saxon or Old English love poetry, and fortunately they were not tampered with by the Christian clerics who were bent on imparting moral and religious color to almost every single literary work. That's why these works retain their authenticity in the expression of their unadulterated ardor. Now let's continue our discussion with some of the important Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry. The paganism of the Anglo-Saxons crumbled when it clashed with the Christian missionaries who continued the work that was begun by St. Augustine and his monks. It took nearly another 100 years for the successive groups of missionaries to convert the whole of England to Christianity, and the new faith had a profound bearing on the Anglo-Saxon literature. The Christian monks started to compile or edit the predominantly heathen-spirited pagan poems and marked them with Christian overtones, and by the 8th century, the techniques of Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry were almost transformed to purely Christian themes and produced a substantial body of Anglo-Saxon religious poetry which has emerged as an entirely new genre in English literature. One of the most significant writings of Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry was The Dream of the Rood, which is again a poem of 146 lines preserved in the Vercelli book. The work probably dates from 750 AD or earlier and is the oldest surviving English poem written in the form of a dream vision, which is a genre that became very popular in later English poetry. The poem primarily discusses the event of the crucifixion in a very symbolic way, and the entire story is narrated by a participant who witnessed the act of crucifixion. The narrator describes a dream in which he saw the Holy Cross, which is symbolized as the historical blood-stained image of suffering. The cross appeared in his dream and described the story of the crucifixion in terms of its experience and how it emerged as a glorious symbol of Christ's passion. After the dream, The poet states that he felt a sense of longing for his death and salvation and decided to live a pure life. Although the work bears the appearance of an objective poem, it is essentially a personal poem based on a religious theme. That's why it is considered one of the finest and earliest examples of English symbolist poetry, which stands as the symbol of man's earthly life and ultimate salvation. The next is Ellen, which is preserved in the Vercelli book and tells the story of St. Helena's discovery of the cross in the Holy Land. The story occupies 14 sections of the poem, and the 15th section provides the only information known about Beowulf and also contains his signature. He stated that he was already old and dying when he wrote this poem, and his early life was sinful, but a spiritual experience has brought him enlightenment and the gift of poetry. That's why we can say that this poem holds a significant amount of importance in Anglo-Saxon literature due to its religious aspect and biographical details that it conveys. Moving on, let us take a brief look at what constituted Old English prose. The prose written by the Anglo-Saxons is distinguished by two notable features. First, it is the result of Christianization and took place wholly in England, which has nothing to do with Germanic origins. And second, it is essentially nationalistic in spirit. Despite the destruction of Old English poetry after the Norman conquest, Anglo-Saxon prose survived as a legacy of English nationalism. Old English prose retained some amount of originality and personal quality in spite of being predominantly a derivative from Latin, and also, since the prose of that period was simpler than poetry, it was able to strike a more responsive note with succeeding ages. The discussion on the presence of Old English prose begins only from the time of King Alfred the Great, about whom we had heard in our previous session. He was the king of West Saxon who ruled from 871 to 899 and was largely responsible for the restoration of learning in England after the Viking invasions. He was not only a warrior but also a patron of art and literature who translated various books in Latin into Old English and is believed to have planned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, about which we will discuss shortly. He expressed his desire to make education more accessible through his translation of Pope Gregory the Great's Cura Pastoralis, which is a manual of instruction for the clergy. Then he added accounts of the experiences of contemporary travelers in his translation of the Historia Adversus Paganos of Paulus Orosius, while his translation of Bede's Latin work Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorium, which is more commonly known as the Ecclesiastical History of English People, exceeds all his previous works in terms of perfection. This work of King Alfred traces the development of Christianity in Britain after the withdrawal of the Romans and the consolidation of the Christian faith under various saints. Now let's move on to our last topic of today's lecture, which is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So what exactly is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle? The Chronicle is the collective name for the 7 surviving manuscripts and a fragment that provide the fundamental narrative sources for the Anglo-Saxon times and perhaps the most important document that we have today. It is also the main literary source for Anglo-Saxon history, beginning with the reign of King Alfred and continuing in the Peterborough version until 1154. The major text known as the Parker Chronicle is believed to have been written by a single scribe who is probably a cleric in King Alfred's service. The chronicle covers the history of the English people from the time of their arrival in Britain until the year of compilation, and the compiler used various sources including genealogies, Bede's history, previous analytic material, and oral reports. It is said that as soon as the chronicle was compiled, it was distributed to the monasteries and churches across England, as we already know that monasteries had a very important role to play in Anglo-Saxon times. Even after the Norman conquest, the Old English literary culture didn't stop abruptly in 1066, but the changing form of the language of the later entries also indicated how a standard written form of English could no longer be maintained in the post-conquest era of England. While researching the annals, historians found that the quality and quantity of the different sections may vary from each other, as the earlier annals were only mere lists of events and not narrative accounts. But then the narrative passages grew better in the 9th century annals, where the writers expressed themselves clearly and simply while avoiding the monotony that was quite common in chronicle writing at that time. Some of the segments of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles record events of local interest together with those of national significance. It is true that the subject matter and the length of the entries vary considerably from version to version, but collectively they provide a systematic record of events from the beginning of the Christian era to the death of King Stephen in 1154. This is considered to be the only surviving document that enables us to seamlessly enter the Middle English period and also identify certain continuities that were not only evident in prose but also in the cultural and religious life of England. That's all for today's lecture. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.